Well, hello to the Count County for this new episode where I talk about this little book. That now the title would translate to the Travel Tales in New France by Samuel de Champlain. Now the edition I has is not a really good one for a number of reasons, including the fact that the one who translated them from the Renaissance Old French to Modern French had a few biases and decided not to include some works because either he found them repetitive or because they were in yeah, this truly annoys me. Or if because he repetitive when he went back on some of his ideas from before, or because he considered them to be apparently not legit, such as his tales when he was in South America. Of course, I doubt the legitimacy of the guy who made that choice, and he could also not take into context that someone talked differently to Henri IV of France, so one of the good Henrys, contrary to England, a while back. And so that guy we talk differently than, for example, to Cardinal de Richelieu, the guy from the Three Musketeers. You might have heard of him, despite the fact that the movie and series version are not book accurate and not history accurate, but this doesn't matter. What matters is what the book contains. Also, some of things that happens after the book and in other contexts that I learned afterward. And amongst these incredibly interesting things that I did learn, well, there are the technological level of the native in North America, and more precisely the region of Canada and the border states. Now, one of the things is many people would merely dismiss them as being Stone Age cultures and forget that the Maya and Aztecs were also Stone Age culture, but did build great things, so the notion is not really appropriate. And even within the Stone Age, there's a lot of different levels. So how advanced really were the natives of North America? Well, that's where we get in with the book and the numerous observations by Champlain. First of all, in terms of weapons and armor, they knew how to make some types of wood armor as well as use thick clothes. And with that, they could protect themselves a bit. Sure, it was not a lot, but it was still a bit, and it was useful against some of their weapons. So at their level, the armor were appropriate. And there's the fact that they could make some, which is quite interesting and more than many would credit them with. As for the weapons, well, sure, they may not look that sophisticated in comparison to some examples like guns or swords or whatnot, but they still were really efficient. Now, they did have bows, so that's that. And quite efficient bow they could use to hunt and for war. They had castite, which were a type of mace that was really powerful, the axes, spears, quite a variety of things, and they knew how to use them well, and they were of good fabrics within the limits of their materials. They didn't have any metal yet, and that was pretty much their limit, but it was still really good quality stuff that could give some trouble, and in between them it was really efficient. That brings me to my next point, the materials. So treating skins to get leather, which they knew how to do. Sure, shaping stone is a really complex thing, but it's not that hard. You want to hear about more advanced techniques, but they knew how to prepare food in a variety of ways. They did have proto-fermentation, where they would put the ear of corns in the ground and let them, in fault of a better word, rot for a while. You do have to know that corn in itself is not edible. It has to be prepared in a number of ways, from being turned into flour, popped, several ways of cooking, including being boiled in certain products. And what they did with the rotting is that they kind of used that to pre-digest, with a fault of a better word, the corn, and in a way it is a step in the direction of fermentation. So they did not have corn beer, but they might have developed it a bit further down the line. Of course, making their bowls, their ships, they, in terms of using wood, they were really advanced. They knew, but overall, they knew how to alter the materials that they had and to make the most of them and get some sub-products of decent quality. Of course, I spoke of the ships. They're, for a lack of a better word, naval engineering was still quite advanced. In fact, Champlain never had any problem with them, and if we read him, this is really high quality grade for his standards. So despite being made out of seemingly not so resilient materials, they were way more resilient than one would credit them for, and they were incredibly light and perfectly adapted for the river travel that they were used for. So for what they needed, they had almost the best that they could have, if not the best, and it was good enough that no Frenchman ever had a problem about using them. Of course, getting to a waterfall, getting drowned because you did stupid stuff is a thing, but the idea of using them, no, that's reliable, no problem with that. It's a technology that they adopted pretty fast because it was that good. In fact, between the materials and the ships, we should say that they were perfectly adapted for the environment, and that include winter adaptation, give guns to natives and get enough of them. They might even have a chance against Russia in winter. So yeah, the making ships using what they had quite high. In terms of agriculture, well, they did not use fertilizer. They used a special method where they just cut down the trees, let them rot, grow stuff in there, and when the ground was exhausted, I'm translating a French expression, but when the ground was no longer proper for the use of their plants, they just moved around, and nature just took back its right, and everything grew back. So it was in a way sustainable. It produced them enough that they could make surplus to last through the winter, and Canadian winter is harsh. In fact, they made enough surplus that they could trade between different tribes and with the nomad tribes. So of course I'm speaking of the sedentary one. Nomad tribes did not have agriculture, and that is something that Champlain wanted to teach them so that they would no longer depend of good hunts in the winter, because they did suffer a lot from famine when the winter wasn't proper and they could not get a good hunt, and that harmed them a lot. In fact, the French, the Champlain, did give them quite a bit of food at several occasions to prevent them from dying of hunger. And that's something that Champlain wanted to settle, not of some sense of pretended superiority of anything, but out of proper compassion that he did not want them to suffer. Now, going back to fermentation, corn could be compared to wheat in terms of how much it was used, and in fact they did make some flour out of it, which goes back to the material altering. And they also had some special techniques like the southernmost native, like their southern cousins, sorry. And so like the Aztec, the Maya, and all the others, they grew their plants together. So you had the corn, and around which there was the bean, and using the corn the bean could grow, and they also put the squash all around and use them to complement everything. And also the squash they all use squash, beans, corn, they all use different nutrients from the ground, so they can be grown together and it can be efficient. The problem is that the ground gets dried out. Yeah, I'm gonna stay with exhausted. Gets exhausted still relatively fast, but when there's stuff in there's nutrients in the ground, it's really an efficient technique. So they had good agriculture. It was just not as developed as that as the Europeans, but they were still quite advanced, and they didn't lack for anything. And not only that, I'm from close there and there, it is likely that they were just at a slight discovery, a slight push forward to getting even further ahead. In fact, I do believe that if they discovered the use of animals or another method to increase the ground, even just alternating cultures or getting different places that they cultivate at different time, things like that would have increased their cultivation, they could have reached the little push that they needed to go even further ahead and really start building something big. Still on the plants, in terms of remedies for all the diseases they had and a few things, they had quite excellent herborists. They knew how to treat a lot of illness. So their healthcare and medicine, but we could mainly say herboristery and apothecary techniques were in a comparable point to the Europeans. Of course, they did not have surgeon or other injury healing that was on the same level. They did not have the same tools, nor a lot of the techniques. But in terms of the use of plants, once again, they did not lack for anything. And it's one of the points where they could even teach the Europeans about a few things, since the Europeans did not necessarily know about the plants in the place. And with that, they could get ahead pretty well. Now, in terms of building, they know how to make walls, how to make permanent houses of great quality. Most of you might have in net the Iroquois Longas, but it was not just the Iroquois. The Huron and all the other tribes of the similar linguistic groups called les tribus iroquoiennes in French. So, but it's not a proper term. It's just that there's some similarities between a number of nations, and with all these nations, in fact, even the nomad ones, I bet with other architectures, could build cold resistant building. So that proper insulation, they could isolate themselves from the cold. They could preserve food from the winter and build buildings that allowed them to do that. With their walls, they could be somewhat safe, in fact, endure siege. Siege warfare was a bit of a thing, and when arriving and taking part in some missions against some Iroquois that were at war with absolutely everyone else, Champlain did took part in some siege battles. So, in terms of warfare and building, they were at that point. They were also building some non-living, non-fighting related buildings. In fact, they had several funeral constructions that they made when mourning people and before burying them, or burning them, depending on the civilization. But burials were quite a thing, and they did some pretty fancy stuff. So once again, much more than they are credited for. And they were at the point where they could build more cultural buildings and had a mastery of wood for that too. And yeah, they also knew copper. In fact, they showed Champlain a lot of copper mines. They knew what it was, they knew where to find it, they just were not at the point where they could extract it and start using it. On a societal level, as mentioned, that proper funerals, but there was much more than that. They had several, they had their own very developed cultures with a lot of interesting details. They had elections, which in comparison to nepotism is a much more advanced system. Their tongues were really easy to learn. In fact, pretty much everyone spoke several languages. Learning French was no problem for them, but learning their language was no problem either for the religious orders coming there, or even just random Frenchmen sent there to learn the language to be an interpret. So that they were linguistically quite involved. In fact, their language was so easy to learn that that Bible was easy to translate. In fact, translating the word cross was easier than explaining the concept of the cross. And that's something that the Jesuits eventually had to deal with. They were really open individuals. Hence why many of them eventually all became allies with the French. In fact, some could say that the true founding of Canada, or at least true Canada, is all these tribes getting in peace with each other, thanks to Champlain being a good diplomat and them having some goodwill. So all of that make a good idea. In fact, they even were beginning to form nations. There were several confederations by the Huron, the Iroquois, and so on. And therefore, these nations were pretty much lots of different tribes that were allied together into a nation. So they used the word confederation, or more precisely it was attributed to them, but they were indeed at the beginning of forming states. And also, I should mention that they had an artistic boom thanks to the French. So, with the metal tools that the French traded them, they got an even greater mastery of wood, and or more precisely, they could just use wood with better tool, which allowed them to do even greater things. And with that, there was an artistic boom because with these better materials, they could just do more things, which is another clue to where they exactly were. And where they exactly were, this is my big conclusion, it's that they were on the verge of the Copper Age. My personal theory is that left to themselves, it would have been a question of time before the nomad tribes got themselves into agriculture, but more importantly that the agricultural and semi-sedentary groups, they were at a slight development, just a small technological advancement, just to push the agriculture a bit forward, so that they could permanently settle down and not move every few generations, or at least move even less and have even more leftovers. And add that little push forward, they would have been able to generate great surplus, and with that they could have put resources aside to start making great things, and with that their nations could have consolidated. In fact, with trade, they could have consolidated even more with more tribes on the side, and they could have put stuff on there on the side to start building great things like pyramids. An Iran pyramid could have eventually, maybe without the Europeans, there would have been a Iran pyramid right now. And since they knew copper, with these new resources, they could have put some aside to start extracting and playing with copper, and then enter the Copper Age. And with the Copper Age, we speak metal tools and everything that comes with it. And of course, starting to form nation and become permanently sedentary would have eventually also led to them developing writing. Or in other words, as of now, they would have been the same place as the earliest stages of ancient Egypt, when it was finally unified and started to develop several things like, writing, copper, eventually bronze, and all the great buildings. So they were close to that point, on the verge of the Copper Age, and maybe they would have went pretty fast to the Bronze Age. Maybe they could have even skipped it and just went on straight to Iron, depending on their findings. So yeah, really at the edge of the Copper Age is where they were. And it is I think, something that is quite interesting to consider. And it put things in perspective a lot. So I hope you liked it. I hope I pronounced better. And if somehow you find that translation, or if you learn French, I really suggest you read the works of Samuel de Champlain, because they're worth a read. On this, I bid you farewell, and until the next episode.